A man was found dead in a park in Medellin, with no bruises or signs of violence. But a tiny detail on his clothing completely changed the way we understood the case. What seemed like an unsolvable mystery ended up revealing a truth no one expected. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. I am Mauricio Cardenas, a forensic doctor, and I have been investigating deaths in this city for over 15 years. I have seen hundreds of cases, but none like this. It all started on a cold night in a very busy park. The body of a man was found sitting on a bench, looking peaceful. There were no obvious signs of fight or accident. Nothing. Just someone who seemed to have fallen asleep forever. At first, everything suggested it was a natural death or an unexpected event, like a heart attack or an aneurysm. But something didn't add up. My familiarity with these situations led me to pay closer attention even to the smallest details. The way he was dressed, the position of his hands, every fold in his clothes. It was then that a very small detail on his jacket caught my attention. A nearly invisible badge, which at first glance looked like a simple decoration, but it was the key to discovering who that man really was and what had happened. What seemed like a simple case with no answers turned into an intricate story involving secrets, deception, and even a network of corruption. In short, I learned that in forensic medicine, what seems insignificant can be the most important clue. In this video, I will tell you step by step how that small detail changed everything. So stay until the end, because what we discovered not only surprised my team, but also the authorities and the deceased family. When I arrived at the park that morning, the first thing that caught my attention was the almost unreal calm that prevailed around the body. A man in his 40s, dressed in simple but clean clothes, lay almost as if asleep under an old oak tree. There was no blood, no visible injuries, nor signs of a fight or accident. No one around seemed alarmed, and neither police nor paramedics had arrived yet. The only thing out of place was that strange feeling in the air, as if something was about to be revealed, hidden in plain sight. My experience had taught me that these seemingly clean cases were the most difficult, because the truth does not always show itself in what is obvious. So I approached cautiously, observing every detail. After examining the body without finding any wounds on the skin, I searched for signs elsewhere: the head, the hands, the neck. Nothing. There were no marks, no swelling, nor external signs indicating trauma. It was perplexing. Normally, a sudden death usually leaves visible clues, whether a blow or fall, or at least marks pointing to a natural cause. But this was not that case. As I continued external inspection, something caught my eye. The man was wearing a dark coat, and in one of the pockets he had something folded. Instinctively, I took that small item and unfolded it as if it held the key to the entire mystery. It was nothing more than an old black and white photograph, with worn edges, showing two young men sincerely smiling, one of them with a gesture very similar to the person before me. I wonder who the other person could be, and why he carried that photo with him. At that moment, I felt the scene, so cold and stripped down, begin to take on a new dimension. It was not just a lifeless body of a man, but the gateway to a much more complex story that would require patience to unravel. Inside the coat, I also found a small notebook, but before opening it, I paused for a moment to look again at the surroundings. No one seemed to have witnessed what had happened to him. There were no signs of a struggle, nor that someone had dragged or hidden the body. I decided to take a sample of the clothing for more detailed lab analysis, but I also wanted to examine the notebook, which, although it seemed simple, I sensed it was not. Opening it carefully, I discovered it was filled with notes written in small, cramped handwriting, almost a personal code. There were dates, names, and places, many unknown to me. It seemed like a diary or a record of meetings. My mind began working, weaving possible connections. One name repeated insistently, accompanied by notes about meetings in different parts of the city, precise time references, and a word that echoed in my mind: trust. That made me think that perhaps the man had been involved in something delicate, something that required discretion and a certain secrecy. But what could it be? And how did that explain his death without apparent violence? Shortly after, the police colleagues arrived, and I shared with them what I had found. However, in the search for more clues, one of the officers carefully removed the coat to check the lining. That was when the detail no one expected appeared. Sewn in, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a small tag with a number engraved, seemingly very old, marked with ink that time had barely erased. That number turned out to be the key to opening a file in the judicial database, a case that had been closed for years, almost forgotten. When we consulted the information, a long and complex story emerged, related to disappearances and important testimonies that had never come to light for protection reasons. It was as if the man had wanted to leave a signal, a coded message for someone like me, with patience and a trained eye, to discover. With every new piece of information, the story unfolded before me like a map with secret passages. I couldn't stop wondering what had really happened. Had he been the victim of a conspiracy? Could his natural death be linked to something much deeper? The silence of the park, the absence of visible wounds, everything began to make sense now. That small detail in the clothing was a clue that connected directly and subtly to a bigger mystery, an impossibility that the man had died without leaving visible traces foretold that his story was destined to be revealed step by step. That certainty pushed me to halt any quick conclusions. I knew that behind the apparent normality lay a truth buried in the shadows of the past, a secret that deserved respect and patience to be unearthed without rushing into mistakes. Thus, with the file in hand and the body sent for a more thorough autopsy, I began a path that would lead me to interview those who knew the man, analyze his movements, and discover that often, the answer to a mystery is not in what we see, but in what we learn to observe calmly. Patience, respect for small details, and the willingness to go beyond the surface. Those were the lessons that morning reminded me of. That experience taught me that even in death, when it seems everything has been said, there is always a whisper hidden in the simplest things, a disguised truth that can change everything. And the most striking thing at the end of the day was not just discovering what had happened to that man, but understanding that our duty as forensic experts is not only cold analysis, but also listening carefully to the silences that reveal what no one dares to tell. The file that number led us to was barely the tip of the iceberg. Each page contained fragments of lives that had fallen silent, testimonies that seemed to have been lost in bureaucracy and time, and a web of facts that, at first, were bewildering. There were other disappearances, reports that apparently were never connected to each other, and a pattern that only someone with enough patience could begin to discern. I felt a mixture of unease and responsibility. This was not just any case, and the weight of what lay before me grew heavier. I returned to the park that same afternoon, this time with my mind full of questions, and the feeling that each step forward would be a key unlocking doors hidden for decades. The light, now dimmer, made the shadows of the place seem to whisper guarded stories. While carefully observing the body still resting on the equipment of the mobile morgue, I found another detail that had gone unnoticed. A discreet shirt button sewn at chest height on the coat, but with a strange design, a symbol I did not immediately recognize. It was not common, not even typical of clothes I encountered in my daily work. However, I remembered that the files mentioned a group that used similar emblems, but that connection had to be confirmed. The night became both ally and enemy. While consulting databases, making phone calls, and searching old reports of related cases, the mechanism began to turn slowly but steadily. I interviewed some agents who had worked in the area years ago, and they recalled with some caution that the area had been the site of several mysterious disappearances, though nothing had ever been clarified. Some suggested political reasons. Others feared it involved mafias or organized crime, but the truth was that no one had clear answers. I felt that, little by little, I was touching something many prefer to keep locked away. The next morning, while the lab analyzed the clothing and fabric samples, I decided to finally open the notebook more carefully. That tiny handwriting, which seemed like a puzzle, began to be partially deciphered. I found matches between the dates noted and reports of presence or disappearances in certain parts of the city. More than a diary, it seemed to be a meticulous record of clandestine meetings, save zones, code names, and emergencies the man jotted down so he wouldn't forget or lose memory of what might have been his personal mission. The word trust appeared like a mantra, repeated at key moments, as if to remind him of the importance of not failing in that invisible circuit. With every line read, I discovered that the man had not only been a victim, but also a privileged witness, and perhaps a fundamental link in a network that sought to protect those who, out of fear or necessity, had to remain anonymous. That revelation made me look at his lifeless face with deep compassion and an unquenchable curiosity. What stories did this man hide? Who was the other person in the photograph? And what was their relationship? Every word, every number in that notebook was a thread beginning to unravel a network larger than it seemed. The autopsy provided me with an unexpected twist. While the external exam showed no wounds, the internal analyses revealed something subtle but significant, an unusual toxin in the blood, something extremely rare that is not usually detected in routine tests. It was not a common poison, not the kind one thinks of when thinking of poisoning. It was something more sophisticated, a compound that affected the nervous system slowly and silently, capable of killing without leaving obvious signs. However, that substance did not reveal who or how it had been administered, only that the man had been subjected to something carefully planned. As I gathered this data, everything made sense. The stealth in his death, the discretion with which he carried his notebook and photo, the hidden symbol on his coat, the records and the old files. The story had layers, each one seemingly hidden to protect many people. I began to understand that this man, more than a casual victim, was an unwitting guardian of secrets that could topple structures or endanger others if revealed without caution. And at the same time, he had left clues, small signals invisible to the common, but clear to those who know how to look carefully. The investigation let me visit places I had only known from maps and reports, marginal zones of Medellin where fear and silence rule, but where hope and resistance also survive. I spoke with distant relatives who barely knew anything about his life, and with old acquaintances who avoided giving names or details with clear reluctance. In each encounter, I felt that mix of urgency and caution, as if stirring a speck of dust could unleash a storm. I understood that the man had carried that burden for a long time. His death was not the closure, but perhaps the beginning of a new search for justice and truth. One more name appeared in my notes, Julian. He was not in the photograph, nor in the documents, but he surfaced in testimonies as someone who might know about the hidden side of the story. He was an informal informant, someone who, I was told, had collaborated partly with the authorities and with groups in the shadows. Contacting him was difficult. It took me days to find him, and when I finally did, his gaze was that of someone who has seen too much and does not expect relief. During our conversation, with careful and measured words, details began to emerge that confirmed my worst fears, at the same time gave me hope. The man's death had not been an accident or an isolated mystery, but part of a chain of secrets and silences that the city was paying for with blood and oblivion. Julian spoke of protection networks, broken agreements, betrayals, and loyalties woven with invisible threads between neighborhoods and institutions. He said the photograph was testimony of a pact, of a promise that had been lost, and the notebook, a log that could either start repair or unleash the storm. I felt I was facing a case that went beyond forensic work, one that demanded not only medical knowledge, but also empathy, prudence, and a renewed commitment to the truth. After ending that interview and stepping into the daylight, the city seemed different, as if the shadows I felt in the park had condensed into the very texture of the air. The death of that man, silent and stealthy, became a powerful reminder that justice and truth are not always found in the obvious. Sometimes they lie in those small details most ignore, in a nearly erased label, in a forgotten notebook, or in a photo worn by time. I still don't have all the answers, but I know the path begins there, with the conviction not to let the story fade away into silence. Every step I take is a tribute to the patience that case taught me, and a reaffirmation that in our work there are no absolute truths or quick closures, but a constant process of discovering, respecting, and at times healing. Because, in the end, it is not just flesh and bones that remain, but the story we can tell and the justice we can build for those who can no longer do so themselves. After that conversation with Julian, I returned to the laboratory with a mix of nervousness and determination. I knew I was facing a complicated puzzle, but I couldn't afford to lose momentum. As the tests kept coming in, each result led me to less familiar ground, but also more revealing. The toxin remained a mystery. The chemical analysis reached a limit that meant seeking experts abroad, specialists who work with rare compounds designed for very specific fields, from biotechnology to military pharmacology. That was when I knew this was not a common crime, much less a fortuitous accident. Meanwhile, each line of the notebook, which at first seemed incomprehensible, began to take on an almost tangible meaning. The notes not only served to track places and people, but also had coded messages with an almost poetic language, a network of signals and warnings that only those involved could interpret. I found references to secret meetings, fleeting meeting places, and a concept that was repeated insistently. The pact does not break without witnesses. That phrase echoed in my mind, especially because it seemed it wanted to be broken. I tried to compare those notes with police reports, but I found that many documents were incomplete with censored or missing parts. It was evident that someone had acted to erase traces, to prevent that information from coming to light directly. I then remembered Julian's stories about betrayals and broken agreements, and began to understand that I was not just facing the death of a man, but a hidden and intense power system that protected itself with violence and silence. The scene in that park, so simple at first glance, concealed a death filled with fear and reprisals. At that moment, the questions started to multiply because it seemed that each answer pushed me toward more unknowns. Who were really behind that network? How many more people could be in danger? The man in the coat was not only a witness, but perhaps a herald of death, someone who had known too much for too long. The photos showing two men, one of whom was him, took on a new dimension. It was a silent evidence of broken alliances, or perhaps an excuse for revenge. The symbol on his coat button was not just a mark, but a message. I decided to return to the park for the third time, this time with a small, discreet team, to look for any other clues at the site that might have gone unnoticed. Under the white light of the flashlights, we checked benches, trees, even the least frequented corners. Just as I was beginning to feel the search would be fruitless, one of the investigators found a small metal capsule hidden among the low branches of a nearby bush. It was nothing more than a cylinder no bigger than a finger, yellowed by time but preserved inside. I immediately thought it could contain something, perhaps the instrument that caused the silent death of that man. Carefully opening the capsule with the strictest sanitary protocol, we found a thin needle with microscopic residues of the same toxin detected in the post-mortem analysis. The certainty that someone had introduced it into that body unnoticed changed the entire focus. It was not an accidental poison, nor a symptom of natural disease, but a meticulously planned murder designed to leave the least possible trace. For me, it was no longer just about clarifying crime, but about opening a deep wound in the recent history of my city. That morning, I called Julian to tell him the news. His reaction was as serious as mine. He warned me to be cautious, saying that touching the network that way was like disturbing a wasp's nest. I asked him to help me better understand the names and codes in the notebook, wanted to uncover if I could learn more about those involved. He asked for time and discretion, and I agreed immediately, aware that in his world communication could put lives at risk more than in mine. Days of waiting followed, with brief calls and silent consultations. Invisible creatures in the shadows began to move with clear intent. The pressure grew, and with it, I began to feel the strength of the unseen enemy. Meanwhile, a new piece emerged in the investigation. Reviewing old reports, I found a series of weekly documents delivered to a local official, where unsolved incidents were recorded in specific areas of Medellin. One of those reports, dated 6 months before the body was found, mentioned a strange and brief disappearance. A man who had been seen on those same streets in the company of a group referred to as the custodians. It was a recurring word, used cryptically to describe those who watched over an unofficial order. I imagined the deceased man had been part of them, that the trust he so often repeated in his notes was directed at that invisible group that seemed to administer a parallel justice system. I understood that, despite the tragedy, there was an internal struggle, a battle to maintain the balance between the silence that protects and the word that frees. The man who died was caught in that vertigo between shadow and light. That is why he never appeared as a hero, not even as a simple witness, but as a sacrifice piece on a board where the moves were explained by complications beyond common understanding. Days passed during which the tension increased, political pressure near to explode, and glances became uncertain when I spoke with some agents. Silence grew dense and threatening, as if the uncertainty I had managed to break could collapse in a second under an invisible weight. That is why I decided to remain firm but discreet, following a path that seemed tortuous but necessary. I understood that to move forward, I had to trust not only scientific procedures, but also the human stories around me. even when they sometimes suggested danger. One night, while reviewing all the man's notes again, I came across an altered calculation, a date that appeared crossed out but with a barely perceptible note in the margin. The day the bridge fell. I immediately sought information about this event, and soon found something that connected to another disappearance in a chain. That bridge, located very close to the park, was a strategic point, a forgotten corridor where the city disconnected from its own ghosts. That connection added weight to a hypothesis. Perhaps the network protecting certain groups used those spaces as safe points from which the truths that should be hidden were woven. It was clear the man had not only been a victim, but also an explorer forced to know the unspeakable of the city, a man who held the key to a greater mystery and paid a high price for it. I recalled his last steps, the shirt with that button, his almost illegible notebook, the photo that seemed to testify to a broken pact. All those pieces formed a story that could not be simplified or rushed. It was a story that demanded respect and time to be told, a story that reminded me of human fragility before the truths we try to hide. While I was reflecting on this, an unexpected call interrupted my silence. It was a different voice, serious, announcing the arrival of a package with documents someone had decided to send anonymously. It was neither the time nor the place to receive condescension, but upon opening the envelope, I found several sheets with old newspaper clippings, forgotten reports, and an unsigned letter. In that letter, they spoke to me of another name, another link, Laura, a woman who, according to the text, kept secrets similar to those of the dead man and could be in danger. I then knew the case was becoming something alive, that the echoes of those deaths and silences reached the present, forcing me to continue, not to give in to fear or exhaustion. More than a file, it was an open wound, a call not to let those lives fallen into anonymity become shadow and oblivion. The symbol on the button, the silent substance, the deciphered notebook, each of those details had led me to the point where I had to decide whether silence would overcome me or I could speak on behalf of those who could no longer speak. And so, as the days went by, I understood that in my role as a forensic doctor, more than in a laboratory or a morgue, my battle was also in that intangible space where memory, justice, and dignity converge. Patience and respect for those small details, a spare button, a crumpled page, a code word, were ultimately the bridge between death and truth. And I had learned that behind every case there is a story that deserves to be told, but told carefully, truthfully, and with humanity. The story of that man in the park would not end with me. It was a thread I had to hold so it would not break, and so justice, though slow, could follow its course. The letter and the documents arrived like a cold breeze, igniting in me a mix of curiosity and alertness that I had rarely felt in all these years of work. Laura, a simple name, but with enormous weight. As I read the clippings in the letter, I felt that the web I was trying to unravel was expanding beyond anything imaginable, and that she was the next piece on that invisible board where no one played fair. I decided I had to find her before those who did not want the truth to come to light. But I couldn't do it openly. The case had already awakened dangerous eyes and ears, and I had no intention of becoming another victim. I knew I had to be discreet, patient, and above all, careful. The line separating investigation from real danger was thinner than it seemed, and I had already felt it vibrate beneath my feet. So I began to walk down less-traveled streets, speaking quietly with people who, unknowingly, held fragments of that silent story. I paid attention to whispers in cafes, to glances that avoided direct eye contact, and to doors that closed as soon as I mentioned name. Laura was not a mystery anyone had access to. She was a shadow constantly on the move, protected by those who wanted her to remain unreachable. But I had my own drive that needed to dismantle silences with facts, to give shape to what seemed intangible. The following weeks were full of furtive meetings and coded messages. Thanks to Julian, who remained an indispensable ally, I gained access to a series of files that contradicted some of the official versions. There I found records speaking of a missing woman, that same Laura, linked not only to custodians, but also to a group calling themselves the Watchers, a network that, according to the evidence, seemed responsible not only for guarding secrets, but for watching those who threatened to break dark pacts. The coincidence was uncomfortable, and suspicion began to take shape in my mind. Laura was not just a potential victim. She was also a key piece in that delicate balance. On a particularly rainy night, Julian gave me a tip that led me to the old bridge mentioned in that crossed-out note. He told me that although it seemed like a forgotten place, many of the clandestine movements in Medellin had starting points or meeting spots there, because it was a liminal space where the state's presence was faint and the law was sometimes just a distant memory. I decided then that I had to go to that place, not only to look for physical clues, but to feel the atmosphere, to better understand the shadows that roamed the city that seemed to live two realities. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was oppressive, the wind slipping through the cracks of the old bridge, and the sound of water hitting the structure mixed with the loneliness of the place. I observed every corner, the footprints left by passers-by, the graffiti that looked like coded messages, and on one of the pillars I found an almost erased inscription, a fragmented phrase speaking of broken loyalty and hidden revenge. I approached cautiously and took photographs. I couldn't quite explain it, but something at that site seemed to pulse, as if it held a contained breath waiting to be released. However, the feeling of being watched was constant. That night, I understood that the network was wider and stronger than I suspected. I not only had invisible enemies, but also, unknowingly, was entering a territory where the line between allies and traitors was blurry. Scientific evidence, however rigorous, could only take me so far. To navigate that tangle of lies, I had to rely on a sharp instinct and trusted allies. The forensic doctor was becoming, in that scenario, also a detective who had to read between the shadows of human intentions. Shortly after that visit, I received a brief call, barely a whisper night, a distorted voice that for a moment seemed to hold both fear and warning. They said little, only one sentence. "Don't go on alone. Laura is closer than you think, and not everyone wants that to happen." The message was clear, but also bleak. I knew I was entering the eye of a storm, that I couldn't stop without risking everything I had achieved so far. And yet, the discovery also pushed me to continue, because the truth, no matter how painful, deserved to emerge from that web of lies. Taking advantage of this new information, I decided to go to whoever might have the most direct data, Laura's family. It was a delicate path, as it involved entering the private sphere of someone who perhaps already lived threatened by that past. I made contact with her brother, who at first was distrustful, but after long hours of conversations, where I assured him that my interest was to understand, not judge or reproach, he opened up to share fragments that shed light on Laura's life. He spoke of a strong, determined person who had entered that world almost by accident and had become the involuntary guardian of secrets beyond her. He also mentioned the threats they had received, the constant fear, and the long nights when silence was the only protection. These revelations confirmed that we were dealing with a conflict that transcended the death of the man in the park. It was a story where loyalty and betrayal intertwined, where truth was paid for with loneliness and fear. But they also revealed the human dimension behind the case, that side which technical analysis sometimes fails to capture. The pain of those trapped in the invisible webs of power and violence. We kept moving forward, and although fear was constant, there were moments when I felt the pieces beginning to fit together, that perseverance and patient search were bearing fruit. Laura became a central figure, not only because of the threat hanging over her, but because through her story eyes were beginning to open to a reality deliberately hidden for years. Her words, although conveyed by others, resonated in my mind and reminded me why I had to keep going, so that those lives that seemed destined for oblivion could truly be heard. One morning, just as I was beginning to feel the weight of that responsibility, I received an unexpected package. It contained no documents or direct clues, but something much more personal. An old photograph, faded and folded in several places. In it, Laura appeared alongside the man from the park. They were in a dark place, but their gazes were steady, their hands intertwined in a gesture that was not just affection, but complicity and promise. On the back, in almost erased ink, there was a brief but unsettling note. Only the beginning. That image was a silent blow that reminded me again of the essence of everything I was investigating. It was not the story of an isolated crime, but the narrative of lives intertwined in a deep and complex pact, and of the consequences of breaking that pact. Laura and the man in the coat not only shared a story, but were part of the same network of secrets, veiled threats, and hopes as fragile as they were necessary. Holding the photo, I understood something essential. The justice I saw could not be reached by evidence and analysis alone, but through understanding and humanity. The patience I had learned in my profession now had to merge with empathy for those living in that world of silences. The truth was much more than a fact. It was a story of people marked by that fatality and that invisible courage. In the following days, I continued taking precautions, aware that every piece of shared information could mean a new danger. However, the need to build bridges between past and present was stronger. I then decided to prepare a careful report, where every detail, no matter how small, would have its place, so that the story of that man and of Laura could begin to be told aloud, even if only in select circles, under strict discretion. But just when I thought I had control of the process, a new twist upended everything. I found a hidden video in one of the files Julian had given me. It was short, barely a few minutes, and recorded in poor quality. It showed Laura, perhaps late afternoon, in a narrow alley, talking to someone whose identity I couldn't make out. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, Laura seemed to look directly at the camera, as if she knew she was being watched. Then the conversation grew more serious, with words about final warnings, irrevocable decisions, and the price of truth. Those images left me feeling a mix of unease and understanding. They were a brutal reminder that the secrets I had so carefully uncovered were still alive, active, and that there was someone or something willing to keep them locked away at any cost. I felt I was no longer alone in this search, but in the middle of a minefield. While the city continued its usual rhythm, I knew that in its shadows ran forces I could not fully control. What had started as a forensic case was becoming a mission where truth and justice faced deep but not insurmountable barriers. And in that struggle, the key was not to lose patience or faith that even the smallest detail, like that button or a barely legible word, could shake the walls of silence and make way for light. I kept going, aware that the story I sought to tell was much more than a file. It was a testament to fractured lives, broken pacts, and the tireless hope of those who, despite fear, choose to speak so others can listen. The search would not be easy or quick, but I had learned that, in this profession and in life, truth is a thread that must never be let go, even if it hurts to hold it. And I was determined to hold it here and now, so that justice would come, even if late, even if its steps were slow and silent, like death itself. The room was in dim light when I turned off the recording for the 10th time. I looked at the screen with that mixture of frustration and determination that I already knew all too well. Laura, her words, her direct gaze, that invisible invitation she sent from the video, everything seemed like a veiled warning. But it was also a call to not give up. The tension soon became tangible again. The silence could almost be felt as a weight pressing on my chest. I knew I had stepped into a terrain where every move had to be calculated, every word had to resonate with caution. The night outside was indifferent to all that drama. The distant whisper of traffic, the clocks marking the hours, the wind slipping through the cracks in the window. None of them knew the truth that was overflowing inside. I decided that the next move couldn't wait. I had to contact Julian, not to ask for help, yet, but to confirm details, to know I wasn't navigating alone on treacherous waters. The call was brief, with a hoarse, tired voice typical of someone carrying two heavy secrets. He confirmed that indeed, there were people around Laura who did not hesitate to use violence to silence uncomfortable voices. And beyond that, he alerted me to a name that until then had been a whisper in the reports. The custodian. No one knew who he was, nor his face, but his name echoed with a terrifying weight among those who worked in those shadows. It was the echo of a constant threat. The pieces slowly fell into place. The disappearance of the man in the park was not an isolated fact, nor a casual accident. It was part of an invisible chain woven with fear and secrets too deep to be shouted aloud. Laura, the Watchers, and Custodian formed a dangerous triangle on the map of the Forbidden, and I was a stranger venturing in without knowing if I would be able to get out. However, the forensic doctor couldn't step aside now, when everything indicated the truth was as close as the darkness of a moonless night. The obligation to respect that imposed silence weighed heavily, but my conviction that there was something more, something worth hearing, was stronger. The next day I decided to visit her, or at least try. I had obtained a piece of information, a name and an address that linked her to a neighborhood not even frequented by the police due to its reputation. Medellin could be beautiful and dangerous in equal parts, and this place seemed to lean more toward the latter. I walked carefully through those streets. The air was heavy with humidity and suspicion, as if the very atmosphere conspired to keep the shadows intact. I asked discreetly, not revealing who I was nor the real reason for my interest. Something told me that in those walls forgotten by the law, every word could be the last. After several failed attempts, an elderly woman beside a worn window pointed to a dark door with a look that said more than words could. That was the entrance. There were no greetings or questions. The visit had to be brief and precise. I placed my hand on the doorbell and waited with a racing heart, knowing that the pulse of destiny marked every second with palpable force. When the door opened an inch, I saw the reflection of large eyes, scared but determined. Laura was there, perhaps not exactly in person, but that encounter was as real as my certainty that I was on the edge of something that could change everything. Her words came fast, barely a whisper that seemed afraid to break at any moment. She told me that what had begun as a quest for justice for the missing man had turned into a hell where shadows moved too frequently to allow mistakes. She revealed names, dates, movements involving not only corrupt police officers, but also figures of power hiding behind the friendly facade of normality. She had been the guardian of a secret too big, and that weight had marked her forever. Before me stood a woman who had sacrificed too much, yet still kept the flame of truth alive. But just as I thought I was finally beginning to understand, the door slammed shut. A sharp noise, a muffled scream, and a knock on my door made me abruptly aware that I couldn't enjoy that little discovered truth for even a moment longer. I had awakened what they tried to keep asleep, and now, without warning, the threat was real. I took a step back, breathed deeply, and knew I couldn't retreat. That night, when the streets became deadly labyrinths, patience had to be armor and prudence my shield. During the following days, paranoia was a silent but constant companion. Every phone call or doorbell could be the echo of danger. Encrypted messages became the only safe form of communication between Laura, Julian, and me. The network that had once been just a suspicion now revealed itself as darker, with tentacles reaching places I thought untouchable. The worst part was not just fear, but the certainty that someone was always one step ahead, watching every move. But not everything was hopeless. Amid that darkness, I found unexpected allies. A former police officer, tired but with an intact desire for justice, a journalist who had lost much for daring to tell the truth, and a lawyer who saw in our cause the opportunity to break years of silence. Together we began to weave a simple but effective plan, to rescue Laura from silence, to expose those trying to hide the truth, and to open new paths so cases like the man in the park would no longer be forgotten. More than a team, we were a family forged in the urgency of justice. It was during one of those clandestine meetings that the unexpected news arrived, the one that took everything to a new level. Julian called me with a broken voice to say that Laura had been found, but not as we expected. She had left a message, a recorded testimony that would be a bomb when it came to light. In it, she spoke of the custodian as someone not only feared but also deeply involved in lies that had cost hundreds of lives. Her voice was firm, confident, but underneath there was a fear you only feel when you are about to challenge the darkest power. I knew her words could change the course, but also that they could cost her everything she still had. The video unleashed a storm. The circles of power moved quickly to discredit, to hide, to intimidate. But this time there was something different. We were not alone. Public pressure began to grow. Media attention intensified, and finally, society's gaze turned to those corners that had long been void of justice. The patience this process demanded, the precision in every step, translated into tangible progress. However, reality was cruel. Every step forward meant a longer shadow at my side, a heavier threat to overcome. What began as a forensic case then turned into a battle to unravel the truth hidden behind layers of fear, manipulation, and false appearances. Laura, the man in the park, the watchers, and the custodian were no longer just names in a file. They were symbols of silent fight, where every detail had the power to break chains. And I, as a forensic doctor, hold a conviction intact that this fight must not stop. Because on that path, I have learned that justice is not always swift nor always visible, but it is a flame sustained by patience, truth, and humanity, even in the deepest darkness. And as I close this chapter of the investigation, I know that all we have discovered is only the surface of a much more complex and painful story. But I also know that small detail, the one no one expected, is the key to opening many doors that have been closed for too long. That's why I keep going, with a mixture of respect, caution, and unwavering faith that the thread of truth, though fragile, can bear the weight of justice. And on that thread, my hands will be steady, because every deserved story, every silenced voice, deserves to be heard until the end. The news about Laura's video spread like wildfire among the few reliable people we had left. A mix of hope and fear seeped into every conversation, because we knew that recording was not only a double-edged sword, but also a stray bullet fired at an invisible target. No one could know for sure what would come next. And yet, there I was, watching the shadows stretch across the walls of my apartment, wondering what I would do if everything fell apart in the next moment. That night, the vigil was endless. I sat in front of the documents, going over every detail that could help understand Laura's message. Every name mentioned, every place mentioned, every planned date. There was too much information to absorb, and each piece seemed to open new questions rather than give definitive answers. In that moment, I grasped more strongly than ever the complexity of my work, and why patience is not just a virtue, but a vital necessity when it comes to unraveling secrets others will want buried forever. As we progressed, the threat became more tangible. It wasn't long before an anonymous package arrived at my house. It was small without a sender, but inside was something that chilled my blood. Photos of the place where they found Laura, images of her last hours, and a brief, clear message: "Leave this now or you'll be next." Through those words, I could feel the cold shadow of someone who believed themselves untouchable, playing with fear as a tool of control. But no, this warning would not stop me. On the contrary, it rekindled a silent fire that had begun to consume me. We knew the police formally assigned to investigate were entangled, infiltrated, and every official attempt to move forward had been silenced with violence or corruption. So we decided to take a less visible but safer path. We pulled back, planned every step cautiously, approaching those who truly knew the streets, who could move without raising suspicion, but also those who had valuable information to uncover. It was then that a new name appeared, one I hadn't heard in the initial reports. The Spider, a mysterious informant who seemed to have access to data no one else could obtain. Contacting him was a calculated risk. He didn't answer calls or common messages. We used a very complex encrypted channel, keywords that only a few in our network could handle. The first meeting was clandestine, in a forgotten cafe in downtown Medellin, where gazes mingle with shadows, and nobody seemed to be there by chance. The Spider was not who I expected. He was much younger, restless, but with fierce determination. He gave us information that again stirred the surface of the case. Connections linking the custodian with a front company dedicated to urban development projects that, according to him, hid much more than mere financial resources. What we began to uncover was a web of deep corruption extending from official sources to private investors, with a central nexus where the custodian moved pieces, removed obstacles, and silenced voices. Every new name that appeared in our documents was not only a piece of the puzzle, but also a warning that we were entering dangerous territory. Yet we couldn't stop. Every time we thought we had a clear path, a new obstacle or revelation emerged that twisted everything we thought we knew. One night, while reviewing details of a new lead, I felt someone watching me. The streetlights flickered, and I knew my phone could be tapped. I couldn't call or send messages without risking detection. I then decided to change strategy. I went to a public place, an almost deserted library, where privacy was a luxury and technology limited. There, slowly and cautiously, I opened an old notebook where I recorded key observations. The routine and calm pace of the place helped ease my mind, although I knew the storm was not far away. It was in those moments, weighed down by silence and blank pages about to be written, when an unexpected blow shook the investigation. Through an urgent call, the Spider informed us that a prosecutor we considered an ally had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The official version spoke a heart attack, but we all knew it was a lie disguised as routine. That blow was a clear sign. The power we faced was capable of using death as a message and was willing to go as far as necessary. The stakes had risen, and there was no turning back. That day I decided that the truth Laura had clung to, even at the cost of her life, could not remain buried. We had to make her testimony, as brave as it was reckless, break the silence of society that too often looks the other way. The team reorganized to protect themselves and prepare the release. Measures were taken to secure copies of the video and safeguard the identities of those involved. But amid that protection, an urgency was born, not to let the truth be swallowed by the darkness of fear. Meanwhile, the community began to react. Some independent media started questioning official versions, publishing reports that sparked debates and challenged the established narrative. Social networks became a discussion ecosystem where the story of the man in the park and Laura's disappearance gained dimensions much larger than expected. It was a slow and sometimes frustrating process because resistance to change was fierce, but the movement could no longer be stopped. Patience, once again, became the engine driving every small advance. At the same time, I received a private message that made my heart race, an anonymous invitation to a face-to-face meeting in a neutral location with a promise of decisive information about the custodian. No one knew who was behind the invitation or their true intentions, but the need to move forward was stronger than fear. As I headed to that meeting, every step echoed in my mind like a refrain, asking the same question. What if this was a trap that would destroy us completely? The designated place was an old train station no longer in use, a space full of echoes and clandestine memories. Two shadowy figures awaited me, barely visible in the faint light of a lantern. What they said unleashed a mix of surprise and bewilderment. They not only had fresh data about covert movements within the prosecutor's office and the police, but also claimed that the custodian had started losing control over some of his trusted people, which in turn opened a breach for us to act with force. It was information to be taken with caution, but indispensable. I returned convinced we were facing a key moment. However, uncertainty remained. Who could truly be trusted in such a dense web of lies? The answer was unclear, and every decision was like walking a tightrope. But that night made me understand something fundamental. The battle for truth is not about absolute certainties, but sustained courage despite fear. About a lie not only with data and justice, but with hope itself. The next day, just when it seemed we could finally advance toward the revelations we needed, a new twist hit me hard. Laura, who until then had communicated cautiously, sent a final encrypted message. It was a warning about an imminent plan to destroy key evidence in the case, and a call to act quickly. In her words was a heartbreaking mix of urgency and resignation. The feeling of someone who knows time is running out, but will not let the truth die without a fight. That night, we lowered our guard, if only slightly. We knew no protection system was infallible, and that the line between life and shadow was growing thinner. Nothing we did was free of fear, but neither could anything take away the conviction that behind every detail, no matter how small, was a story worth telling and a man who, even without a name, sought justice in the middle of the night. That quest, I think now, is what unites us and makes us human. As I move forward with this story, it's impossible not to feel that bitter mix of certainty and doubt between the temptation to throw in the towel and the need to keep going step by step until reaching the last truth. Leo Tolstoy said that the impossible takes just a little longer, and that phrase resonates powerfully in my mind. This case, which seemed a simple mystery in a Medellin park, became a web of personal secrets, power, and tragedy, reminding me that in forensic medicine, more than in any other profession, silence can hide a story that only an unexpected detail can reveal. And it is that small detail, invisible to most, that taught me how true justice is sustained, with patience, respect, and a gaze that refuses to settle for the superficial. Because, in the end, no matter how much fear or danger you face or how dark the night that surrounds you is, the truth is there, waiting to be discovered. And that thread, fragile as it may be, has the power to change destinies. So, even though we don't know what comes next, I will stay here every day, holding that small light that does not go out, convinced that in justice, as in life, the unexpected can be the beginning of everything. When I walked away from that meeting at the abandoned station, I felt as if the air itself had grown heavier, as if the silence around conspired to hide something no one was meant to discover. The information that the spider had given us, although filled with promises, also came with an unbearable weight. The fragility of balance, the constant threat, and the lurking suspicion became inseparable, almost physical, companions with every step I took. When I returned home, I found myself turning over Laura's words, that last coded message that sounded more like a scream into the darkness than a clear signal. The plan is underway. There's no time left. I felt a mix of helplessness and determination. Nothing would be the same after that. The moment to act was approaching, although the risk was higher than ever, and our internal network was full of cracks where trust was seeping away. Everything seemed to indicate we were facing a perfect storm, a carefully woven conspiracy, people willing to do anything, and us trying to tear that veil apart with our nails. In the days that followed, the pace of our investigation shifted from methodical work to a race against time. We knew they would try to erase the evidence at any moment, aware that what we had in our hands could bring down their entire corrupt framework. But acting hastily was as dangerous as standing still. That's why the team chose a dual strategy. While some reinforced security and doubled the copies of the evidence, others of us infiltrated those seemingly impenetrable circles, searching for any sign of the plan Laura had warned us about. I remember one particularly dark night when I left without warning and found myself in a dimly lit bar, a place where the smell of cigarette smoke and cheap coffee was a layer covering many conversations hidden from sight. There, I was waiting to receive a key piece of information that the spider had promised days earlier, something that could give us a definitive clue to get ahead of the custodian's moves. Hours stretched out between whispers and cautious glances, until a young man finally appeared with scroll of data recorded on a USB drive. The information contained was devastating. Recordings, messages, contracts, all related to the front company and certain suspicious transfers, but the most relevant was a direct connection to several officials who until then seemed untouchable. Each discovery opened a Pandora's box. We were up against a corrupt system that used the law for its own ends, where fear was not only a weapon but a shared way of life. It was then that I understood with brutal clarity that this was not just a forensic case. It was a battle against a power established in the shadows and fortified by impunity. I felt an enormous weight on my shoulders, but also a deep drive for justice that kept me awake, with my heart burning despite the fatigue beginning to gnaw at me. As we unraveled the thread, other pieces emerged that I hadn't even imagined. The press, despite sometimes playing a timid role, began to resonate strongly. Some brave voices took up the story and gave a platform to the denunciation. But at the same time, we received unmistakable signs that not everyone wanted this ending. One dawn, just when I thought I could rest a little, I found my car with its tires slashed and another note, "The truth hurts, but it also kills." It was a warning, a call to back down that, instead of intimidating me, made me realize we were moving in the right direction. What was hardest for me to accept was the human cost, the collateral damage this dark network caused by the will of those who ordered and executed it. Laura had become, unwillingly, a symbol of that fight, and her courage was a beacon for those of us immersed in this abyss. But she was also an open wound that reminded me that behind every piece of evidence, there was a life shattered irreversibly. It's not easy to keep going when you know each advance can trigger irreparable consequences, but it was my duty and I knew it. The team grew stronger not only technically, but also in mutual trust. Every face in that network began to be part of something much bigger than a simple case. We were guardians of a truth many wanted to bury. Complicity and discretion became essential tools. Every step was planned to maximize impact and minimize risk. The patience I always mentioned had evolved. It was no longer just waiting, but an almost military strategy to maintain the initiative on a highly hostile terrain. There was a moment etched in my memory with almost painful clarity. One dawn, while reviewing new evidence in the mobile lab we had set up to escape official eyes, a call interrupted the relative calm we had achieved. It was another message from the spider, this time much more urgent and cryptic. They are moving the pieces. Revenge is near. Protect what matters and distrust even the shadow. The warning was clear and it caused an internal stir. We all knew an imminent blow was coming, and we had to shield ourselves for what was ahead. The following days were a dangerous dance between advancing and protecting. We tried to anticipate those moves, shifting resources, contacting allies, and securing evidence in different locations. It was then that we began to notice internal fractures within the corrupt apparatus pointed out by the Spider. Some who had previously followed orders unquestioningly now began to show doubts. Without a fear or morality, it wasn't clear. That fracture, although small, gave us a much-needed breath, a crack through which light could seep into so much darkness. Despite that glimpse of hope, tension was palpable in the environment. The constant thought that someone was tracking us made every call, every meeting, every message filled with anxiety. That pressure affected me personally. Nights grew shorter, dreams turned into torments, and the line between professional and personal blurred unbearably. But even amid that wear, there was an intact fire, the certainty that surrender was not an option. In one of those almost despairing moments, I received an unexpected call that completely changed the course of the investigation. It was a distorted voice, but clearly human, offering what seemed to be the original recordings of Laura's video, containing material no one else had seen. The interlocutor asked for guarantees and anonymity, but also made clear that what they held could topple the entire corrupt structure. That call gave us back the strength fear had begun to erode. It was concrete proof that the truth would not be a mirage, at least not as long as we were willing to seek and defend it. From that moment, the strategy changed. We were no longer just chasing clues and testimonies. We now had the most powerful evidence in front of us. The urgency to protect that material became an absolute priority. Sessions to secure copies, erase digital traces, and coordinate contacts multiplied without rest. In those weeks, I realized something that had been silently looming. Justice is not achieved only with bravery or intelligence, but with a silent persistence and a perpetual commitment that endures even when nothing seems to advance. It was then, almost unexpectedly, that the small detail I described at the beginning, that particularity in the clothing of the man found dead in the park, reappeared as a symbol. It was not just a clue at a crime scene. It became a guiding thread that linked the most scattered pieces, a hidden code Laura had wanted someone to decipher. That detail, which many had overlooked, was the key that allowed us to grasp the real scope of conspiracy and why the silence around it was so deadly. Understanding that point was like opening a secret door, one that connected the prosecutor's office, the police, urban development projects, and the silenced voices. It made us realize that the truth, although often covered by trivialities and distractions, only needs someone to look at it with enough attention and courage. That lesson, deep within me, is what motivates me to keep going, even when danger lurks at every turn. But I also know this story doesn't have a simple or quick ending. Each day brings new challenges, new shadows, and new revelations. The justice we pursue is not a destination but a path, a slow, painful construction that requires patience and an unquestionable commitment. And although fear never completely disappears, the hope that little detail gave me keeps me steady, with the conviction that no truth, no matter how deeply buried, can remain hidden forever. Sometimes I think of Laura and all those who, like her, chose not to remain silent. In them, I find the strength not to stray, not to let corruption and fear win the battle. And I know that while there's a light, however small, it will make sense to keep searching, keep telling this story, step by step, until the last veil is lifted and justice can finally shine, not just as an ideal, but as real and tangible justice. And so, with that fire that does not go out, I remain here, telling this story, remembering that true courage is not in never falling, but in rising stronger each time. Because deep down, that's what it means to be a forensic expert, an investigator, a human being, daring to look, listen, and pursue the truth, even when everything seems to conspire to hide it. And this, without a doubt, is my most impactful case, a constant reminder that in the smallest details can be hidden the greatest truth, and that truth has the power to change everything. What came next was a succession of events difficult to fit into anyone's routine. Every small victory, no matter how insignificant it seemed, felt like a hopeful sting amid a freezing wind that relentlessly battered us. At first, the revelation of a detail in the clothing appeared to be solid ground for our investigation, something that would help unravel a case seemingly closed, even trivial. But As often happens in such matters, that same detail, almost insignificant at first glance, opened a deep breach that exposed a network where nothing was as it seemed and every step could cost everything. On one of those long days, sitting in the shadows of the makeshift laboratory, I reviewed once again the photographs and diagrams of the outfit of man found in the park. There were a couple of worn buttons on his jacket and a small pin, barely visible, with a symbol that few people recognized but that, in reality, pointed to a much broader and more complex network of influence. A symbol that appeared repeatedly in documents we had managed to obtain after long hours of investigation, and hidden from those who could prevent us from moving forward. That pin was ultimately the piece that linked a case that appeared isolated to the layer of corruption in the spheres of regional power. The following days turned into a toxic game of cat and mouse. At times, we seemed to have the initiative. At others, we were on the verge of everything vanishing due to a friendly hand the system wanting to bury the truth in oblivion. It was a time when every encounter became a tangle of suspicions. Sometimes I couldn't even tell if that shadow I felt behind me was an enemy or a paranoia fueled by exhaustion and pressure. One of the critical points was safeguarding digital copies of the evidence held by the team. They became our most precious treasure, something to be protected with the same care a guardian would use to protect an invaluable jewel. From there, we decided to take extreme measures. The transport of the evidence was organized in small parts left in different places, each guarded by someone trustworthy. It was not just a technical matter, but a moral commitment to the lives of those involved. I knew we were being watched and that at any moment, a brutal action could try to silence us forever. The tension became almost physical. Those who know me understand I am usually calm and thoughtful, but those weeks turned me into a man with nerves always tense, alert, awake like the last lighthouse before shipwreck. Amid that chaos, unexpected allies emerged. Some strangers who preferred to remain anonymous but gave us vital information. Conversation schedules, suspicious movements. Some gave data out of fear. Others with a strong conviction that change could no longer wait. Each piece arrived with scars, and I don't just mean physical wounds, but the visible weight in their eyes, the fear marking their halting words. It was in that crucible that a resistance network began to form, uniting diverse sectors that alone were weak, but together started to become a force. What I never imagined was that the man with no visible injuries had left a message, hidden in the trivial, so that someone like me could understand it was no ordinary case. Another episode that marked a decisive turn in the investigation was when we managed to infiltrate a clandestine meeting of the group known as the Custodian. The information that the Spider had given us led me to that place, a dark space accessed only by invitation or direct recommendation. There, under flickering light and surrounded by figures negotiating in whispers, I witnessed plans being woven that involved much more than bribes or embezzlement. Moves planned to silence, to sow fear at levels I had never seen before. It was a moment when I understood that the most dangerous side of that network wasn't just visible corruption, but their capacity to destroy lives without leaving a trace. I returned from that meeting with an unbearable weight, but also with a firm certainty. If the truth came to light, it would change everything. However, I also realized that the debate was no longer in the legal or judicial sphere, but in the deep ethical dimension of each of us. It was a fight against a system trapped in its own lies, but also against the personal where that battle causes. At times I felt the ground eroding beneath my feet, that my work, my life, even my integrity were on a tightrope. But the hardest lesson for me was to understand that I could not afford to fall. The pressure increased when, on an ordinary day, the proximity of danger took a more tangible form. I found on my desk an anonymous letter written in capital letters in red ink, leaving no doubt. Don't continue or you will pay dearly. That message became a challenge. On that same sheet, right beside the threat, there was a photograph of the man from the park, but this time showing the insignia in detail and underlining the word forget. It was the cruelest warning I received, an invitation to fear that could paralyze anyone. But I knew it was proof we were touching something bigger than we imagined. The following days were a mix of caution and swift moves. The team armored itself, and I, despite the fear, decided to intensify the search. We couldn't take a step back. I focused on reviewing all photographic and video material we had, looking for a pattern, a connection that could point us to the actors behind that symbol. That obsession led me to review forgotten files, to dig through data from years ago, and finally to discover that the insignia was related to a business association that, on the surface, promoted investments in social projects but operated as a facade for a network of rigged contracts in the shadows. Every link we unraveled led to a new name, a different face. And with each new name grew the feeling of being living pieces on a dangerously complex board. There were public officials, businessmen, even police members involved in a structured network to protect personal interests and eliminate any threat in their path. What seemed like a senseless tangle gradually took shape, a disturbing map pointing to a power that fed on impunity like a voracious being. Amid the tension, we decided to make part of the case public through carefully calculated confidences shared with independent journalists. We needed to generate pressure that forced the authorities to act, although we knew those same powers had voices in official media. The risk was high, but the need for a valve through which the truth could breathe was stronger. The impact of the publication was immediate. Protests, calls for investigation, and a stirring in several communities that had remained silent until then. I felt that, for the first time, the shadow began to lose ground to the light. But not everything was a linear escalation towards justice. The attacks continued, and one of the most critical moments came when we realized someone had infiltrated the system we used to store digital evidence. It was as if betrayal had a face within our own team. The distrust sowed was a harsh blow. It took hours to control the damage and secure a new encrypted communication line that even I, with my experience, had never designed at such a security level. That night, solitude was my only companion. The risk was no longer abstract. It was in the small details, in every keystroke I made to advance the cause. Meanwhile, the spider became more cryptic and her messages less accessible, as if she too sensed the danger we were all exposed to. One night she sent me an audio with only one message. Trust the invisible, listen to what no one says. That enigma led me to consider that the smallest detail, the one that initially seemed just a meaningless adornment, was actually a coded message designed to reveal the real names behind the hidden powers. What seemed a window to the past ended up being the key to open several doors locked with triple security. In the process, Laura's figure became omnipresent not only as a victim, but as a symbol and guide. Her bravery and decision to confront those shadows became the compass guiding us through the darkness. Every step I took in her memory was an act of vindication, an act that helped me put into perspective that this fight was not only personal, but an ethical mandate to all those who had lost their voice. Being part of that team was a privilege, but also a burden I took on with all the responsibility that comes with being a human seeking justice from the trenches of knowledge and truth. I cannot hide that the experience changed me. It changed my view of forensic work, the role of the doctor, and also the reality around us. I learned that our work goes beyond analyzing bodies and circumstances. We are guardians of the truth that can, if identified and protected, save dozens, hundreds, or thousands of lives. What seemed an isolated case in a park turned into a mirror of society, reflecting corruption and fear, but also resistance, hope, and the impact of perseverance. In this investigation, I confirmed that nothing is as simple as it seems, and that time is sometimes our best ally, but other times our worst enemy. The patience I spoke of is not coldness nor slowness. It is a form of resistance, a silent strength that supports the fight when circumstances threaten to tear everything down. And that small detail in the clothing, that forgotten and almost invisible pin, is tangible proof that truth hides in the tiny, the least considered, and only a watchful eye, constant work, and uncompromising commitment can uncover it. Perhaps I will never fully understand why life put me on that path, surrounded by fears and fragile certainties. But I am clear there is no turning back. The story I told has no closed ending, because corruption, unfortunately, has no end. What it does have are breaking points, spaces where shadows must retreat even if only a little, so that light and hope can enter. That is the greatest lesson I take away. Justice is not a glorious point, but a daily construction, sometimes with small, almost invisible steps, but always necessary. And with that thought, I move forward. There are still many pieces to move, many truths to discover and protect. I know the risk will keep lurking, and that loneliness can sometimes be unbearable, but I also know that the most powerful story is the one someone dares to tell, the one that shows that even in defeat the seed of change can sprout. That is why, while I have breath left, I will keep looking for that detail, that hidden sign that can burst a lie, that can give voice to the silenced, and that, finally, will open the door so justice is not an empty word, but a palpable reality for all. What followed those days of paranoia and intense surveillance was a flood of events that seemed taken from a suspense movie, but nothing at that moment was fiction. Each lead brought us to a dead end. Every shadow we thought we had dispelled multiplied in ways we had not anticipated. I remember that night as if it were yesterday. The atmosphere in the laboratory felt heavy, as if the very air conspired to stop us. We were gathered, disconnecting cables, organizing digitized documents when the light flickered for a moment and then went out. It was not a simple blackout. We felt that someone had broken into our space, a direct act meant to sow fear. At that moment, I knew we were one step away from crossing a line no one had dared to cross before. A few minutes later, a cryptic message appeared on one of our secure communication devices. Everything has its price. The truth you seek may bury you. I don't know how many times that message echoed in my head, but the truth is that moment became a point of no return. It was a warning that not only sought to intimidate, but also announced a possible sacrifice. We were too close to uncovering something that could change the very structure of those powers entrenched in Medellin. That in itself gave us courage, but also tested our emotional endurance and commitment. From that point on, the investigation took on a much more cautious, almost ritualistic tone. The team split into small groups, each responsible for analyzing different aspects of the case. While some focused on financial documentation hidden behind the business association, others delved into studying personal connections and political ties that sustained that corrupt network. In my scarce free hours, I reviewed time and again the profiles of people linked to the pin symbol. It was like putting together a puzzle where the pieces seemed to move on their own, challenging not only our logic, but also our patience. But I never allowed myself to lose sight of the fact that the man found without visible injuries was that key piece, that thread on which more depended than we could imagine. The internal tension also grew. It was not only the external threat. It was the palpable where among us. Some doubted the path. Others felt the pressure was too much. There were nights when silence was the only companion, and suspicion an invisible enemy that slipped into conversations, looks, and slips. However, there were moments of light. Days when a new piece of evidence emerged like an unexpected flame, or a clue noted in a margin restored our determination. In such extreme circumstances, the human bond becomes the only real defense against the abyss. And so, amid uncertainty, a camaraderie was forged that transcended mere professional collaboration. An episode that marked a new turning point was when, thanks to a reliable informant, we managed to access a secret file within the business association that guarded a spotless facade while sustaining from the shadows a machinery of bribes and blackmail. That file contained records of suspicious financial movements that, at first glance, seemed like simple donations or social investments, but in reality mass payments for irregularly awarded contracts and silent agreements with key public sector figures. The surprise was not only the monetary scale, which was already alarming by itself, but the involvement of figures who, in daily life, projected an impeccable image before the community. Exposing that duality was a direct blow to the official narrative. Hours spent connecting dots among people, dates, and places revealed a plan much more sophisticated and cruel than we had anticipated. We discovered that the man in the park was not an accidental victim. His position, although humble and his appearance ordinary, had made him an uncomfortable witness. He had dared to fight from his sector against the injustices covered up by that powerful group. And he was erased not with visible violence, but with meticulous planning aimed at silencing him, without leaving obvious traces. A message that, however, they failed to fully conceal because that small pin on his clothing persisted as an unmistakable mark. At one point, I realized that that badge was not only a symbol of belonging, but a mark the victim had intentionally left, a way to call attention to that network without uttering a single word. That changed the whole investigation's perspective. From then on, every piece of evidence, every document or testimony, took on new meaning, as if we were gradually uncovering not only crime but resistance, a silent effort demanding to be heard. That revelation led me to understand that justice has many forms, and that the truth can hide even in what seems insignificant. As we progressed, external pressure increased. The threats rose in tone and frequency, including anonymous calls at odd hours and discreet surveillance. Yet, every attempt to intimidate us only reinforced my conviction. It was then that, quietly, we decided to begin a process of consulting human rights organizations and whistleblower protection groups. This network gave us not only support, but also expertise on how to handle a case with such political and social impact. This connection strengthened our team, which, though small, became a movement with more implications than we had imagined. Collaboration became global, involving actors who recognized the importance of uncovering these kinds of networks. One early morning, while reviewing documents to prepare a report that would serve as a basis for formal complaints, another disturbing message arrived from the Spider. It urged us not to dismiss the possibility of infiltrators within our own circle. That warning led us to conduct thorough internal checks because, on such slippery ground, blind trust was precisely the Achilles heel. We discovered strange movements in the system aimed at erasing evidence, and it was then that we understood how infiltrated, rooted, and meticulous the plan of those seeking to perpetuate silence was. I thought a great deal about Laura during this process. Her figure was not only that of a victim, but of a guide who taught us the importance of truth when it seems impossible. Her bravery was a constant call not to give up, to push even beyond fear and threat. This feeling reminded me that, although the path sometimes becomes dark and tortuous, what defines those who fight is not never falling, but getting up again and again. At that point, justice ceased to be an abstract idea. It became the beacon that compelled us to move forward despite everything. The work culminated in the preparation of a compelling dossier that, supported by independent journalists, detonated a bomb in public opinion. The faces that were once symbols of trust were now questioned, pointed at by irrefutable evidence. What seemed like an uneven battle turned into a collective awakening. But that victory was not easy. The immediate response was a furious attack from corrupt spheres, a series of maneuvers to discredit evidence and pressure witnesses. The fight was now waged on all fronts, from courts to media, passing through social conscience. At this point, I find myself thinking about that small pin, that initial detail that seemed insignificant, a flame that ignited the search for truth amid a sea of lies. That man with no marks on his body taught me that silence can scream with a single gesture, that in the smallest things there is meaning, and that patience is not simply waiting but resisting and understanding. What started as an ordinary case ended up being a battle against a system that would have preferred never to have its cracks discovered. And although that battle is far from over, I know that as long as there is one person willing to look closely, to question the obvious, and to value the small, justice has a chance, no matter how difficult. Thus, I continue learning and moving forward, aware that the cost may be high, but convinced that giving up is the true price I cannot afford to pay. Because the true detail, the lesson hidden in those dark days, is that truth is not just a professional goal. It is a commitment to humanity, to those who have been silenced, and to those who still dream of a fairer world. And perhaps, just perhaps, in that small forgotten pin lies the key for justice one day to stop being a remote concept and become a tangible reality for all.